This is weird. I've never been behind the camera like this. I never saw myself being a YouTuber in this sense. So this is just, I guess, cue the cringy 2000s background music. No. So I don't know if introductions are really in order. My name is Clara. I run the Submissive Worship channel, and I've really enjoyed doing that. I think it's been about a year since I started the channel. I had to take a break during the summer because I was working and didn't have time or resources to do this anymore, but I'm hoping to pick up in the fall. This is not relative whatsoever to what we are doing today. I am so sorry. But I wanted to talk about my story and just kind of share what I've been through and the way the Lord has moved in my life, and I hope that it'll encourage you or just remind you of our God's goodness. I was raised in a God-loving home, church, youth group, youth retreats, summer camps, that whole 9 yards. And I always believed in God, and I always believed in Jesus. Like the majority of Christian 5-year-olds, we all kind of prayed that prayer in Sunday school of, Jesus, I know I'm a sinner, and I love you, and I believe in you, and please save my soul. And, like most Christian 5-year-olds, I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't really understand really what that meant, and my conversion wasn't genuine. And before I get to the main part of my testimony, I'd like to read from Psalm 116, verses 1 through 8. I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my supplications, because he has inclined his ear to me. Therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. The pains of death surrounded me, and the pangs of Sheol laid hold of me. I found trouble and sorrow. Then I called upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I implore you, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Yes, our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. I was brought low, and he saved me. Return to your rest, O my soul, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. When I look back on the last 6 years of my life, I can see that God has been faithful to me in living out exactly what is in those verses. As an perspective, I was a very, very happy kid. I was one of those always sees the bright side in everything types. But when I was 10 years old, I went through something very traumatic. And in the span of 24 hours, I went from being that kid to being a kid who could barely function day to day. I developed a very severe panic disorder, the name of which I will keep to myself for safety reasons. I don't trust the internet. But I have a lot of symptoms that come in with that, like, aside from just the intense anxiety, nausea, leg bouncing, pacing, racing thoughts, dizziness, nail biting. I used to scratch at my neck a lot just to keep my hands up near my ears so I could cover them. And anyway, that's not really the point. I'd like to focus on 2 specific symptoms just because I think they kind of throw it into perspective what I went through. The first being that from that point forward, I really struggled to go to sleep at night, which is kind of where the hands by the ears thing comes in. I would curl up and I would put my hands either over my ears or by my neck, and just to keep them there in case I started hearing things, or just so I could cover my ears if anything happened, or I flinched at every noise in the house, and it would take hours for fatigue to win over just so that I could sleep. And when I did sleep, I had really vivid nightmares. I would wake up physically shaking and fall back asleep and immediately have another nightmare, and that was just routine. That was every night. And the second symptom, I was very, and the whole sleeping thing, that probably was, I want to say 4 or 5 years I experienced that. I ended up being pretty sleep deprived in general, I think. The second one was I was very anxious socially. I don't have social anxiety. That's a different condition. I'm not claiming to have that or anything. But leaving the house was a serious ordeal for me, and it could be church, it could be youth group, it could be school stuff. I could literally just be going to the grocery store, and it would be very hard for me to be out and about and functioning. And with a lot of things, like, the anxiety would start days before, like, I knew I had something. Like, say I had youth group on Friday, I would be really anxious on Monday, and then it would just increase as Friday approached, and then I would be super anxious the night before and hardly able to sleep. Nighttime was really hard in general. And the most difficult part of this entire experience, spanning from 10, 11 years old to, say, about 14, 15, is I felt totally alone. I was not saved at this point when this whole thing started. I didn't feel like I had anyone to turn to. I didn't feel like I could talk to my parents. I could have, of course, but I just didn't feel like I could at that point in my life, and I was terrified. I mean, I was simply put, I was a really scared, lost child. I was 10 years old, and I just had my life flipped over in just a few hours. I didn't even realize that there was something wrong with me. I think it took a couple of years for me to really process and acknowledge that what I was going through day to day was not normal, and that there was something wrong with me. It just did not click with me, and I suffered like that for a couple years before I understood this is not okay. This is not what a normal child goes through. There's a lot of shame in society, I think, surrounding mental illness, and now that's become kind of a trend among teenagers. It's generally not taken seriously, which makes life a lot harder for those of us who actually were sick as young kids, because even if we did say, like, I'm struggling with this, you'd probably be overlooked because it wasn't really as bad as we made it out to be, because everyone's got anxiety now, you know. And in Christian circles, I often heard anxiety preached as a sin, and when I was really young, I was really confused about like that. Why would a loving God be angry when I was anxious? And we'll come back to that. Let's just talk about the main point, which is my salvation. Living in a constant state of panic brought me to terms with my own mortality. I was hit with the understanding of God's sovereignty like I'd never known it before. I just understood his power and his authority and just who he was over us. And I knew that at that point I was not part of the kingdom, and I believed in hell. I believed it was real, just as I believed in Jesus, and this sparked a really desperate search for a way into the Church of God. I think this would have been when I was about 11 years old. I started reading my Bible like every night, and I was seeking, I was searching, I was so desperate because I knew where I stood with God and where I needed to be, and that I was not there, and that if I just snuffed, you know, at any point, like, that was it for me. And I just was desperate, so I was searching and seeking, and thankfully, shortly before I turned 12, I found the answer in Romans, you know, the typical confess with your mouth and believe in your heart and you shall be saved. And I remember how kind of shocked I was that I had been seeking for so long and the answer was so simple. I mean, even now, I'm kind of in awe of the simplicity of the gospel, you know, understanding your fallen state, confessing and asking for forgiveness, and believing in Jesus's sacrifice is really very straightforward. I don't know why I had this I had the idea that God needed to do something, that God needed something from me, and that's just not the case. We are saved because God loves us, and that is enough. And that was incredible to me. I found Christ that night, I think exactly 1 week before Easter. And the amazing part of that is the year before, 1 week before Easter, was when I had originally fallen ill. And I think God has a funny way of arranging things in our lives to be kind of, I don't know, it's kind of ironic, you know, you fall sick a week before Easter, you get saved a week before Easter. I think God really just is showing me in some ways that he is in total control and he orchestrates everything. So I was saved. Yay. That's not actually where the story ends for me. While my soul was saved, my mind was very much broken. My illness went deeper than just a lack of faith in God. I was very physically sick. And over the next several years of my life, nothing really changed. I still lived in constant fear. I was still constantly praying for deliverance. I had nightmares and hated leaving the house. I hated having people over. I used to love traveling as a young kid, and now it's just stressful and anxiety inducing, and I really hated traveling and making long car trips, and that's still kind of true. I do love traveling. Anyway, it's not the point. When I was 15 in 2020, things started to really go off the rails in a way. Not going into too much detail, I went through small-scale sexual assault and was then backstabbed by, I say backstab, it's a little dramatic. We'll just leave it there, by a very close friend that I loved very much, and, you know, going through all of that in the same week after months of being cooped up inside, and we all know about the unmentionable disease, and you can imagine that did not help my already declining mental health. And when the school year started, I took on too many classes. I was working part-time in a very stressful job and trying to maintain rapidly failing friendships that I was really desperate to keep. And through that year, I became more and more stressed and more burnt out. I was basically going 24/7 with no rest. And all of that caused my disorder to worsen to the point where I broke down almost daily. By the time we hit December of my sophomore year of high school, I was very suicidal. Very. The prayer that I took to praying almost every night was, God, either make it stop or kill me because I can't take this anymore. I mean, that was a low point, just asking God, like, if just let it end, please. And I don't care if that results in my death, just make it stop. I was hopeless. I could see no end to the anxiety, to the depression, to the stress. Every day started badly and ended badly. The work never ended, and the struggle only got worse and worse. The only thing that kept me alive at that point in my life was God's promises. He promises us peace, joy, happiness, deliverance. For I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall mourning, nor crying, nor pain. Sorrow may last for nighttime, but joy comes in the morning. All things are possible with him who believes. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The sufferings of the present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. After you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. And this one, which I actually just found last night, which I think was very reflective of what I was going through. I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I leaned on those promises and many others like them because there was no light at the end of my tunnel. I couldn't see myself ever healing, ever coming out the other side. I had no hope for a future, but God promised me healing. He promised me hope. He promised me a future and a purpose. Everything in the Bible said that suffering has a purpose, and while you may never know what it is never meaningless. And I clung to that like a lifeline. I clung to the idea that someday it would end. I had nothing else but the hope of Jesus. Spoiler alert, I'm still alive. After months and months of praying and begging, God started answering my prayers. And not just the prayers that were currently consuming my mind for rest, but years of prayers asking for healing and peace. Throughout my junior year of high school, I was given more rest than I could have hoped for. And I finally started to heal. I started the school year more or less the same as I always was. But over the course of the year, I was less anxious chairing meetings. I never stressed about leaving the house. I went to lessons and was able to just much better curb my anxieties. I rarely had nightmares. In fact, most nights I would just turn off my light, lay down, and go to sleep. And it wasn't until months later that I understood that I was doing that. And it, as sad as it sounds, I was amazed that I was able to just sleep normally. And it seems a little silly, but I was able to just lay down and sleep. No fears, no worries, just going to sleep. I just couldn't believe that I could just go to sleep. So that was really big for me. And I really came to pardon me. It all really came to light during my first competition in January of this year. For context, I am an archer. I've been shooting since I was 12 years old, but due to COVID, this was the first time I could compete. And when we got to the venue the night before, I was very overwhelmed. The competition I had signed up to do was one of the largest in the country. For perspective, it was about 4 days long, and there were about 140 to 200, 300 archers shooting at the same time, not to mention the venue staff, parents, coaches, all, really big event. And I walked out of the room sure that this was the day that my mental illness would just totally win its battle and I would just not be able to survive the next day. And that night in the hotel room, I panicked. I wrote a dozen or so encouraging Bible verses all up and down my arm. And at the top on my wrist was the verse John 5:8. And Jesus said to him, "Pick up your bed and walk." Jesus says this to the man because he's just healed him from an illness that left him unable to function and gave him the ability to walk and dance on his own. The next day at my first competition, I was totally calm the entire time. I wasn't the slightest bit nauseous or lightheaded. My pulse wasn't racing. My thoughts were clear. It was so strange to be normal that after that competition had ended and I had shot 30 points over my average score, I couldn't even care. I was too shocked by the complete peace that I'd had while shooting that the shooting in and of itself just kind of melted out of my brain. Because it was the first time since I was 10 years old that I lived as if I'd never been touched by a panic disorder. It was the first time I've been able to pick up my bed and walk. Since then, I've seen this new reality in a lot of different ways. I've been able to go to the gym, chair meetings, live in a dormitory, have friends over, work as a lifeguard with minimal to no symptoms, like 90% of the time. I do still have bad moments and bad days, but overall, the healing that I have experienced has been nothing short of miraculous. And it's all due to the fact that God gave me time during my junior year to heal and to rest, to study His Word, and just reground myself and just heal. It's really the simplest way to put it. While my condition still exists and will likely always exist, I can now use my healing and my story to show God's faithfulness to His people. When He promises peace, He really means it. When He promises happiness, He delivers. When He says that He will wipe away our tears, He comes and does exactly that. My pain and suffering weren't meaningless. Every step of the way, God was guiding my feet so that eventually He could use me. All those days of not wanting to live, being utterly hopeless, almost giving up, they weren't just a hard patch. And I know that many people go through similar things, and I hope that through my story I will be able to offer them a hope similar to that which God gave me, a hope that they need to keep fighting and having faith. And that's when you come back to Psalm 116. As the psalm says, God has heard me. He has rescued me from the pain of death. He brought me back from a place so low that I almost lost my life. He has delivered me from the worst. He has dealt bountifully with me. God brought me back from the brink of death, and beyond that into a place of peace I didn't think was possible. And that is my testimony, that our God is a faithful, faithful God. All that he promises will happen. Even if it takes some time, even if it takes a little pain, he does wonders despite the fallenness of this world. And whatever it is that you are going through, he will provide healing, and it does have purpose. And, all those verses saying that it will end and peace will come are true. And it is my prayer that anyone going through what I have been through will just cling to that and trust that, because it will happen if you just hang on. I've already seen my story have an effect a little bit. I had the opportunity to give my testimony publicly during a sort of dedication service, and afterwards, I had many people approach me to thank me for sharing. I had one mother who, she came to me and she told me she had a child who I don't think was even 10 years old, but he went through some of the same things, or is going through the same things that I went through at his age. And him listening to me talk and hearing that somebody else had gone through what he had been through seemed to light a fire in him. And hearing that my suffering helped the child to know that he was not alone and that God delivers was probably one of the most liberating moments of my life. It was the moment I knew for certain that all those years of pain meant something. They gave me a story to share. They gave me empathy to help others like me. They gave me a testimony to show God's faithfulness. Earlier in my story, I mentioned that I was so very confused by the idea that our gracious, loving God could be angry with me and my anxiety simply because I was anxious. And I've come to learn that that particular message is often twisted and taught incorrectly. There is a difference between ungodly worrying and being mentally ill. I've done both. I have definitely worried and been like, oh, what if this happens? What if this happens? Where I was just not trusting God with my future or with this particular aspect of my life or my day. And that's definitely lack of faith. But there's a difference between not trusting God with your future and your brain, which is a little organ made of flesh, water, and electrical impulses, being damaged by a traumatic experience and then, needing help. And I hope that now, understanding that crucial difference between lack of faith and physical impairment, I might be able to help other people like myself who are afraid to ask for help because they are afraid of being belittled for an apparent lack of faith. That really all they need could be therapy, medications, maybe just a break from life for a bit to rest. But I hope that people will really come to know the difference between needing physical treatment and, there's a place for both. But I needed help then that I didn't have, and it is solely because of the grace of God that I'm still here today, solely because of his grace. But that's not the case for everybody. Some people don't make it because they didn't get what they needed in the earthly sense. But to conclude, our God is faithful beyond our wildest imagination. Thank you.